Hello, everybody. It's me, Bigfoot, Michigan Rob. It's Friday, February 10th, and it's time for another encounter emailer or subscriber story. This is an email that I got, and I've been sitting on this for a couple months. Frankly, I've been reluctant to release this because of the involvement. It involves the government, money payoff, threats to this couple. In fact, the couple didn't even want to, at first, mention the location. But then later on in the email, the emailer said, you know what, Rob, I need the story to be told, so we will include the actual locations to this. So with that being said, I myself now am a little reluctant to read this. But you know what? I do what I do. I do it for everybody, and this has to get out there. It's a great story. It's a scary and terrifying story. This is entitled Dogman Roams Indiana State Park. Here we go. I woke up to this foul stench about 9 o'clock in the morning on an already sweltering day at Potato Creek State Park in Indiana. My wife Peggy and son Mark trailed our two horses up to the Horseman's Campground at this beautiful state park. The park allows overnight stays, and you can bring your horses to ride the trails. In fact, this part of the park only allows you to stay if you bring your horses. Horse trailers and hitching posts are provided for your stay, and it is very convenient. Peggy and I drove my 27-foot RV, and Mark drove separately with our two horses, Sable and Annie. They were hitched on our trailer to the back of his F-250 Ford pickup truck. Reverting back to my early comment about the stench, you might be thinking to yourself, of course there's going to be a stench. It's a sweltering day, horses, horse trailers. This should easily be expected. And I would agree. But the stench was a mixture of horse manure and something else. It was just strange and odd. Peggy and Mark both had agreed, but we dismissed it and planned our first day. This park is also open to traditional camping, hiking, and fishing, with the main lake, Lake Worcester, situated about 850 yards away or so to the north. This park is very convenient for us as we hail from South Bend, Indiana, and the location of this park is about 12 minutes to the southwest of our home. We settled in at our campsite, extracted the additional living area on the RV. Peggy made bacon and eggs, while Mark and myself tended to Sable and Annie and prepared them for today's ride through the trail. There were several trails to choose from, and we chose the immediate trail not 25 yards from our campsite. Peggy and I rode Sable, and Mark mounted Annie. Not more than 100 feet in, the trail ahead was littered with scat, obviously the source of the smell. I, being an avid hunter and tracker along with my son, decided to get off the horses and take a look at the refuse on the path. I wondered why there was so much and had figured that the maintenance department was slacking behind a bit. This had been our fourth time here in the last 6 years, and never seen this incredible amount of waste. You may ask, why would we get off the horses and look at scat? Yeah, good question. Fair question, he adds. Mark and I also act as part-time Bigfoot researchers, and we always are inquisitive about looking for evidence, such as scat, unusual tree breaks, tracks, or structures. Mark and I got involved in this 6 years ago while camping in Wisconsin when we came across alleged Bigfoot whoops and found several human-like tracks. What was crazy about these tracks is that they measured 19 inches long and had distinct toes and looked human-like. Naturally, we thought about who walks barefoot in the forest and eliminated the possibility that these were human. So that started us on our hunt for Bigfoot. Now, the scat ahead of us was clearly that of horses, but also some that appeared to be dog like. The strange thing is, the dog like refuse was much larger than the horse piles. This struck us to be very odd. We looked for tracks and came up empty. The trampling of horse tracks contaminated whatever additional tracks that could have been around. We continued on horseback and enjoyed the rest of the trail. Upon returning back to the campsite, we took care of our horses, hosed them down to cool them off, and did additional maintenance. We were actually delighted that we had this section of our campsite complete to ourselves. I mentioned it was hot, so most people decided to stay home, and to be honest, we should have as well. We had booked this a year ago, and it was too late to cancel without paying a cancellation fee. So we just sucked it up and decided to enjoy being together as a family. The campground did provide for electrical hookup, and we could at least use the RV's AC. There were shady areas along the tree line that we could use, perhaps later. Maybe in the evening we would make a fire. This story takes a turn when Mark and Peggy, This story takes a turn when Mark and I returned to drop Peggy off at the RV where we could start some early supper. Well, Peggy. We left the RV, went back to the trailer to tend to Sable and Annie 25 yards from the camp. Mark and I proceeded back to the RV when my wife was flailing her arms and yelling, "Come quick, you guys." We reached Peggy and she motioned to us to look around the perimeter of our RV. To my disbelief, as well as my son's, we saw the oddest and frankly scariest set of tracks we have ever seen. Circling the RV from front to back was a set of bipedal tracks. I pulled out a tape measure, distinctly measured from the heel to just before the toes. The track measured almost 7 inches long and 4 inches wide. Now, you can add an additional 3 inches as these distinct, elongated toes extended from what appeared to be a paw. Even worse, at the end of the toes was a set of claws extending from the toes and were driven a good inch into the ground. And these 3 toes were wider than anything I've ever seen. And I make mention of it as 3 toes, which again is odd. Whatever this was, it was big and heavy and not natural. My wife asked, "Is that a wolf?" I told Peggy, "There are no wolves in Indiana, and these tracks I could not discern and was unlike anything I had ever seen." Mark pulled me aside and said, "Dad, is that Dogman?" My son and I, on our quest for Bigfoot, had certainly heard about Dogman. However, if these even exist, they were north of us in Michigan or Wisconsin, where the alleged beast of Bray Road lingers. After supper, it was decided that I would go back to the welcome area and find a park official or even contact a DNR official. When I got there, there was only a receptionist, and all the officials went home for the day and told me to come back in the morning. She asked me what my concern was, and I told her that, well, you know what, it could wait for morning. Boy, was I wrong. Nighttime came, and it was time for bed. We all drifted to sleep. Terror awoke us in the middle of the night as my RV was being shook from side to side. It was violent movement. And at one point, I thought the RV was going to literally tip over. Peggy was screaming and crying. My son and I were trying to get our balance and tried our best to look outside the side windows, but the constant shaking of the vehicle could not allow us any stability. Then it stopped. We all stood in shock and bewilderment. Then we hear a crashing of something being ripped off of its hinges, like a metallic sound. And to my horror, I can hear the sound of one of my horses cry out in an agonizing scream. It sent chills through my body. I had hidden a 12-gauge shotgun in my RV. I retrieved it and ran to the trailer where my horses were kept. I can see that the trailer doors were ripped off the hinges. I then looked to my right and see an extremely tall figure running off into the tree line. I stopped and I fired. Probably a bad idea, but my adrenaline was rushing and it was just instinctive. I got inside my trailer and Sable was slashed a good 8 inches from her hindquarters. The wound was maybe an inch deep and bleeding. I am praying it's not fatal. I yelled back to my son to retrieve the first aid kit. Mark got back. I applied pressure to the wound, but it did not last long with Sable dangerously bucking, making it impossible to help her. I calmly spoke to her, and eventually she somewhat calmed down. My other horse seemed paralyzed in fear and did not move. Yet I knew she was alive. Minutes went by, and I was able to look at the wound. Sure enough, just like the tracks that surrounded the RV, there were 3 distinct claws that had cut through Sable. It was not very long that park rangers and state police arrived, as well as a representative of the park. All of these officials were standoffish. My son exclaimed, "Dogman." They kind of looked at us in bewilderment. Moments later, the park official and a ranger took me aside and urged me to please do not make mention of this. In fact, the park rep told me that all my fees would be waived and offered to pay for whatever medical attention my horse needed. It was worded as if they wanted me to remain silent. In my confusion of all these events, I reluctantly agreed. Exactly 1 day after returning back home to South Bend, I was paid a visit from a governmental official from Fish and Game and a state park rep. They thanked me for remaining silent. In a matter-of-fact way, told me that it would be in my best interest to remain silent. In fear for my family, I kept silent for 5 years, until the date of this email. This story needs to be heard. Thank you, Rob, for allowing me to do so. Okay, what do y'all think about that one? Government showing up at the house, at the park, acting aloof, paying for all the expenses. The next day when they get home from the park, they get a visit. And I imagine it was a stern visit suggesting otherwise, perhaps threatening this family. I don't know. I tell you what, this sounds like a great place to go investigate, doesn't it? I feel for this family. I feel for what they went through. And it just goes to show you, these things exist, and they don't want disclosure. They don't want the word out. And probably, if the word was out, the campsite would lose revenue. Because I sure as hell wouldn't go back there if I was a normal guy. Being into Bigfoot and Dogman is certainly a place I think I'd like to go venture out and see. I don't know about you. I give it a thumbs up. I hope you do too. I am Bigfoot Mission Rob. YouTube offers a share, a thank you share. It's in the tab. If you'd care to donate, that's great. But if not, as I always say, share me out, help my channel grow. Without you, I would not be doing this. Enjoy your Friday. I hope you enjoyed that story. I surely did. And until next time, Bigfoot Michigan Rob, and I'm out.